All right, so I believe that we left off here yesterday with estuaries. And so today we're just going to go through the last couple of slides about the marine environment. Actually, I think we were further than that. Okay, just to remind you from yesterday, um, for our marine ecosystems, first of all, marine means that we're going to have salt water versus our fresh water. Remember that our fundamental division is going to be salinity between the two of those. But for our marine ecosystems, we can divide it into different life zones. So we have our intertidal zone, the benthic zone, the pelagic environment. I also added in the euphotic zone, and the neritic province and the oceanic province. So looking at this picture from your textbook, it has all of the zones except for the euphotic zone. And I'm just going to quickly kind of point to the zones and then we'll go into a little bit more depth. So for the intertidal zone, this is the zone right here between high and low tide. You can kind of see it in yellow on both sides. And the intertidal zone can either be a beach for like where we live, or it could be a rocky intertidal zone. Our benthic zone or benthic environment is just going to be the bottom. So the benthic environment is always going to be just the bottom of, it could be an ocean in this case, or it could also be a freshwater body of water like a lake. So the benthic environment is going to be the bottom, and we're going to break that down into our bathyl, abyssal, and our hadal zone. And the pelagic environment is going to be the open part of the ocean. We have the euphotic zone, which we'll see in a couple of slides. It's just the top portion of the ocean. As you can guess, it has the term photic in it, so it's going to be the zone of the ocean where light can penetrate. And then we break down the rest of the ocean, the entire ocean of being the pelagic environment, into the neritic province and then the oceanic province. So if you notice, the neritic province is going to extend from the high tide all the way out to the continental shelf. And from there, we're going to have the oceanic province. All right, so as I had just mentioned, the intertidal zone is the area of shoreline between high and low tide. For us, we have a beachy intertidal zone. Other areas, many times temperate regions, are going to have a rocky intertidal zone. Many organisms that live here have to have adapted to this constant shifting of the waves and the tides. And it's a very stressful habitat. So the adaptations, depending on if it's a sandy intertidal zone or a rocky intertidal zone. So for our sandy intertidal zone, if you go to the beach, you can think of active birds. So like sea stars, mole crabs, jellyfish. When you're walking along the beach, you can kind of just look in that area and see kind of what we have there. Not a whole lot of life in that intertidal zone. If you have a rocky intertidal zone, you can see from the picture, we're going to have different types of cyanobacteria, tube worms, mussels, oysters, brown algae, sea urchins, and all of these organisms are going to have some type of method to adhere or to kind of be able to stick to the bottom, or they're going to be able to burrow in areas around that rocky intertidal zone. So for the most part, they have suckers or way of kind of holding themselves down so that they do not move in and out with the tides. The benthic environment we can break down into three zones, main zones. It says the ocean floor extended from the tidal zone to the deep sea trenches. So for the three zones, we have our bathyl zone, our abyssal zone, and our hadal zone. Looking at the picture, you can kind of see the bathyl zone of the benthic environment. Again, benthic is just referring to the bottom. It extends from about 200 meters down to about almost 4,000 meters. So this is all considered the bathyl zone. The abyssal zone is going to go from that 4,000 meters to about 6,000 meters deep. And then the hadal zone is going to extend from 6,000 meters all the way down to the deepest portion of the ocean. And we discussed Marianas Trench, the Challenger Deep, so to the deepest part of the ocean. So it goes bathyl, abyssal, and hadal. Just make sure you know that order. And then it's the bottom. For the photic benthic zone, so this is going to be the bottom portion of the ocean where light is able to penetrate. We're going to have a couple different types of organisms that live down here. We're going to start with seagrasses. And so seagrasses are found many times close to the shore. It has to be pretty shallow for them to be able to photosynthesize. So here's a picture of seagrass on the right. Notice that our seagrasses have root systems, so they're going to be anchored down into the ocean floor by their roots or rhizomes. And some examples of some seagrasses that we have in the tropics, we have manatee grass, turtle grass, and up in the temperate regions, some eel grass. And so these seagrasses have adapted to be able to live in salt water. And really through depths of about 10 meters deep. They provide ecosystem services, the seagrasses, so since the root systems are kind of interlacing and holding them down into the ground, they help to prevent erosion along coastlines because we have them where light is going to be able to penetrate. They also provide food and habitat for many marine organisms. So manatees, turtles, fish, even birds are able to eat the seagrass. And the herbivores consume about 5% of all the seagrass. So about 95% of that seagrass enters as detritus into the food web. So it basically dies and it's broken down and then can enter into the food web as detritus. Our next, kelp forests. So this is a picture from your textbook showing you the kelp forests. Kelp is actually brown algae, so it's part of kingdom Protista. It's not part of kingdom Plantae. It does not have a root system. And this brown algae can be as tall as 200 feet. So it can get very, very deep. Obviously, you see some light in the picture, so they are photosynthetic. And our kelp forests, different from our seagrasses or some certain types of seagrasses, are found in cold, temperate regions. And they're also places of high biodiversity, as you could guess. They actually rival our coral reefs. Organisms that live in our kelp forests include sponges, clams, tube worms, fish. We also discussed our kelp forests in regards to keystone species. Remember we said that sea urchins are eating these kelp forests and the sea otters are going to prey on the sea urchins. So they help to keep these kelp forests intact. And you can kind of see the brown algae here has, instead of a root system, has something called a holdfast. And so it basically anchors it down on top of either rocks or on top of some type of, on top of the bottom of the ocean in that spot. So this is our brown algae, which is our kelp. And locations where we have our kelp, you can see around the world here, again, temperate regions, so we're not thinking too many in the tropics, colder climates. You can see the Pacific Ocean, Northern Atlantic Ocean. Again, always like close to the coastlines because they're going to need some sunlight, so in order to photosynthesize. So it can't be too deep, can't be in the open part of the ocean because it's too deep and there's no sunlight. And then our last of our benthic environment that are significant are coral reefs. Coral reefs are made of calcium carbonate. If you look at the map, they're mostly around the tropics. They prefer warm, shallow water. You probably know that the Great Barrier Reef is a famous coral reef out here over the northwest side of Australia. And out of all of our marine ecosystems, they are the most diverse. They are #1 for species richness worldwide, even greater species richness than our tropical rainforest. If you think back to, I think it was chapter 4 where we looked at that bar graph. Corals are really, really interesting. So corals have a symbiotic relationship with an organism known as zooxanthellae. You've seen this word, I think, on a test or a quiz before about symbiosis. And the way you spell that is Zooxanthellae. It's on the board. And zooxanthellae are algae that actually live inside the corals. So you can see like a microscopic version of this. And they go through photosynthesis and they help the coral by providing it with food. The coral in return is going to provide the zooxanthellae, the algae, with a place to live and some protection. And at nighttime, when the coral reefs and the zooxanthellae are not photosynthesizing, the corals have tentacles which can paralyze the zooplankton. So at nighttime, they'll use their stinging tentacles and they're able to consume zooplankton. They grow very slowly. And as I mentioned, a famous reef would be the Great Barrier Reef. Interesting little fact, it occupies about 1.1% of the ocean surface, but has 8% of all of the world's fish species. Now, what are we doing to our corals? Whole bunch of impacts. The first one you see says sedimentation and siltation. So basically, when we cause erosion along coastlines, for example, if we remove mangroves and we build any type of building, homes, restaurants, hotels, we're going to have erosion. So that sand from the beach is going to erode. These corals many times are close to our coastlines where it's nice and shallow, and the sand and silt is actually going to cover the coral, causing it to potentially die. It's not going to be able to photosynthesize properly. Our next is pollution, runoff, and ocean dumping. Any type of pollution that enters into the ocean could potentially harm either the corals or any of the fish that are living in and around the coral reefs. Runoff, for example, like fertilizers. We talked about nitrates and phosphates. It causes algae blooms. Chemicals such as pesticides. Pesticides are harmful to pests, but everything else as well. In some countries where it's not illegal or not enforced for banning of the ocean dumping, any type of garbage or sewage could potentially harm these coral reefs. Overfishing. So anytime we're overfishing, we can be removing some very, very important fish that live in and around the coral reefs. As we have said in the past, the #1 carbon sink, the place where carbon is stored, is the ocean. And so as carbon enters the ocean, it can cause ocean acidification. And the ocean is naturally basic. So a little bit of carbonic acid can cause these coral reefs to basically lose that hard exoskeleton. It can wear away that calcium carbonate. So this can also hurt the corals over a long term to the point where they have little to no exoskeleton. Direct disturbances. If you've ever been snorkeling, you're not supposed to touch the corals. People accidentally do with their flippers, or they accidentally put down an anchor if they're boating. Some people may purposely collect specimens for research. So any direct disturbance can kill off the coral. They are very, very sensitive. And lastly, coral bleaching. So climate change. Just the slight change in temperature can cause those corals to expel the zooxanthellae, those tiny little algae. And once they expel the algae, they're unable to photosynthesize. And that's their main source of food. So without photosynthesizing, they end up dying and they become bleached. And so if you look at the picture at the bottom, on the left side we see a very vibrant coral reef, and then on the right we see a bleached coral reef. Okay, so the pelagic environment, breaking down the last two sections of the ocean, we have the neritic province and we have the oceanic province. And you also can see the euphotic zone in this picture. The euphotic zone is just the top portion again of the ocean, and it is where we have those phytoplankton that are vital to the ocean and also make some what's called marine snow. So once they die, they fall down to the bottom and really provide food for any other organisms that are living out in the open ocean. The neritic province is the area, you can kind of see it here, from high tide out to the end of the continental shelf. I said that a second ago. And I always remember that this is where we can go swimming. And I think about the fact that I can get neurotic in the neritic. I think I said that yesterday. And this is the area closest to the shoreline. So you can kind of, I guess, compare this to the littoral zone in a lake, but this is obviously the ocean. And then the rest of the ocean, the open part of the ocean, is known as the oceanic province. It makes up 75% of all the marine ecosystem. We don't really have a whole lot of organisms that live out here. And if you remember when we talked about species richness, we said out of all of our ecosystems that the open ocean really has very little species richness because there's very little sunlight that makes its way down to the bottom. And in order for anything to live here, it has to have special adaptations. For example, we talked about the anglerfish and how it has its little light and it's able to capture its prey by ambushing its prey. So it has adapted with its little light to be able to live deep down in the ocean. But it's very dark, and again, anything that lives there depends on marine snow. Unless, if you think back to our chemosynthesis and our hydrothermal vents. But for the most part, other than that, we really don't have too much stuff going on there. And lastly, you can read this in your book, just talking about some impacts that we have for our ocean, human impacts on the ocean. So we're going to go through all of this stuff, or maybe we've discussed it already throughout the year. We're going to talk about non-point source pollution and point source. So if you look in the top left, and then all the way down here to the middle part of the right, point and non-point. These are both types of pollution. Non-point is going to be when we can't tell where it comes from. Point source pollution is from a specific place. And examples could be agricultural runoff for non-point, like fertilizers and pesticides. You really can't tell what farm is kind of producing that pollution, but it runs off into waterways and then can harm aquatic life. We did talk about invasive species already. We talked about the zebra mussel, so obviously this can outcompete the native mussel and cause economic damage. Overfishing, so there's lots of fish that have been overfished. Think about next time you order bluefin tuna or Chilean sea bass. These fish now are becoming rare, and so they are prey for another fish, and they also prey on fish, so it's going to impact their food web and food chain. Bycatch, so bycatch right here, this is, we're going to talk about this when we talk about fishing commercially. So a lot of times nets are used in order to capture fish so that, you know, companies and fishermen can make a profit. But what happens is they end up catching an unintended catch, and that's called a bycatch. And turtles and dolphins and seabirds get caught. And even though they may be thrown back into the ocean, many times they are injured, or they're weak, or they even die in that net. So they're super stressed and they're unable to survive. Aquaculture, again, we have a chapter about agriculture and aquaculture, so it's basically fish farming. If it's in the ocean, it's called mariculture, and lots of pollution builds up in one area. A lot of times these fish can be genetically modified, so it's a concern if they escape. They are able to pass parasites and diseases because they're kept in closed pens. It's just like when we talk about farming. So we'll talk about that. Coastal development causes erosion. We remove those mangroves that we said provide us with ecosystem services. Again, habitat destruction with the trawl net goes along with our chapter with commercial fishing. You can see this net's being dragged along the bottom of the ocean in order to capture those benthos, like lobsters, and it's just going to rip up and destroy the bottom of the ocean. And then climate change. So we just had said how climate change can cause coral bleaching, and it's a little bit too late for us as far as trying to fix that. So we're going to see these corals die off, and it's a really sad thing that's happening. Oop. Okay, so that's your last slide. Don't forget, you have your quiz on Monday. Review questions due, and your spreadsheet that we filled out for the terrestrial biomes. And now I'm going to give you an opportunity to use your notes, and if you brought your book, to get about 6 percentage points back for your last quiz. So you check SAS for your grade, and I'll also hand those back to you after your quiz on Monday so that we can review them. So have a wonderful weekend, and go Gators.